The one thing that you mentioned about, especially about land, struck to me is very important because as part of your methodology, the way I understand it, is to move away from, let's say, GDP as a flow variable to understanding growth, but to also look at stocks. Now, related to this, I have a question pertaining to your methodology, of course, but also how you view sort of this recent Nobel Prize in economics that was awarded to Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, where they talk about institutions as extractive and inclusive institutions as sort of the prime mover of growth. So in their book, they mention in a chapter how other theories are wrong, that theories that don't work. Yet, factor endowments, of which, let's say, land is a frontier, or other natural resources, coal, for instance, which was very crucial to the British Industrial Revolution, as well as to Industrial Revolution elsewhere, and which is gradually being depleted, also seems to be a very crucial determinant of growth. So, in this current Anthropocene epoch, do you think that this rejection of factor endowments is a crucial intellectual error in sort of the way economic growth is now being viewed by new institutional economists? What's your take on them?
That's a very, very lovely question, I must say. That's a highly intelligent question. A tough one. I'm not sure I can give you an adequate answer because I haven't thought a lot about it. Sort of like any practicing economist, you work on a problem, you don't. I think it's rubbish to think that everything's on institutions and institutions alone. I mean, we like to think so. We're economists naturally because that's the thing that you can guide. And the imposition of the external world over which we don't really have that much control, can't make, is a bit of a nuisance. We like to think that we can overcome it. So the new institutional economics is not all that new. I mean, we've had many institutional. I mean, there was people like who was this economic historian who
Douglas North?
Sorry,
Douglas North.
Douglas North was an institutional economist. So obviously, goes out saying institutions are important. Goes out saying that. I mean, that's trivial observation. They're extremely important. But the idea that you can overcome, that there are no other constraints, that you can design an institution to solve any kind of problem and go for any kind of prosperity, that at some fundamental level is, of course, rubbish. It just can't happen. I mean, if the Earth was the size of the moon, we would have had a different economic possibilities. Come on. So it's a kind of, I think this obsession with institutions, or rather putting it, that's all that matters. They of course matter, but to say that that's all that matters is a kind of an Enlightenment thinking, actually, that somehow we are above the humanity is above the natural world. It's kind of a, today, particularly to have that view is very odd, given what we see is happening with biodiversity loss, species extinctions at a furious rate, shrunken wetlands, disappearing forests, and the rate of biodiversity loss is just, it's extraordinary now. To think that, now you can say, of course, that's happening because of bad institutions. You can always do that by saying that, you can say that, but it's, that if you can cure that, then the world will look after itself. There is truth in that. Of course, there is truth in that. But we can also say, of course, if the human numbers were fewer, there would have been less of a pressure. You could say that. But that's not politically as correct as saying that institutions are at fault, rather. Maybe that. So, yes, obviously we operate with the physical constraints or biological constraints that institution can't override biology. It can maneuver itself across biological constraints, but there are limits to how much that can happen. So it's not a question of optimism or pessimism. I don't think that's the right way of, at least that's not the way I see these things. There are moments where people feel very optimistic. And you mentioned Esther Bosrup, and she was, in a way, reacting to Malthusian pessimism, and the new ecological economics is trying to come to terms with Bosrup's, not coming to terms with, but to qualify Bosrup by saying, of course, there are things that we can do to expand the possibilities, but beyond a point, it is nature which will set constraints. And I think in many ways, since you've asked a very deep question, and I don't have a very easy answer to them because I don't have one, an answer, easy or not easy. But I think in some ways, if one was to think about the intellectual history, we've had an extraordinarily, let me put it this way, it's some of the pieces that I sent you, I think a few weeks ago, will have this note. We've really gone through a 70-year exceptional period for the human economy. 1950 onwards, say now it's 75 years, but in that we've had if you plot pretty much all the kinds of indices that we use to talk about economic progress, say GDP per capita, you will find that, or life expectancy at birth, you will find that it's pretty flat with slight increase globally. I mean, I'm talking about global figures now. Slight increase from about 1700, 1750 onwards, until it really takes off about 1950. It's almost like the hockey stick curve that you see when you look at carbon concentration in the atmosphere. That from 1950 onwards, there was a huge increase. Population numbers was, of course, a good approximate indicator too. In 1950, world population was about 2.5 billion. Today, it's 8.1 billion plus. So there's been a huge increase over the past 70 years. During this period, if you freeze your attention to that, you will say that we've never had it so good. The average person in the world, that is, ignoring inequalities. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the average, global average. It's been an amazingly good period. Now, if you shrink at it, you feel that, gosh, if this is not exceptional, we can just continue that way. But at the flip side of that same story, if you look at the state of the global environment, that is to say, the ecology of it, you see that's the reverse. That is an incredible decline in productivity of ecosystems. Disappearance of species, of course, is the highlight of it. Okay, and of course, carbon concentration is one manifestation of that. Carbon concentration in the atmosphere is only one manifestation of the ecological overreach. So you can look at the state of the world from two perspectives. One side of the coin is this incredible improvement in most indicators of life, of societal life at the global level. On the other side is an incredible pressure on the natural world, which is ruinous in the sense of backfiring on our attempts at human progress. Now, if you ignore the latter, everything looks marvelous. And if you ignore the former, everything looks extremely depressing, right? And so we need to have some kind of an understanding of how each side affects the other. And that's not been happening in mainstream economics. In particular, you asked about GDP. Of course, GDP doesn't recognize depreciation of capital. So it doesn't look at the other side of that coin in the first place. So you've got a completely wrong index for measuring progress. Now, you mentioned that I was focusing attention on stocks. The reason is, it is an important point, in my judgment, because, and you're right to point this out, because flows don't tell you anything about the future. It's stocks which do. You hand over stocks to the next generation. You hand over rights to flows to the next generation, but those rights to the flows are the stocks. So if you have a refrigerator, you know you'll get a flow of services from that refrigerator. If you have an automobile, you know you'll have a flow of services from that automobile for 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, or whatever, or so many passenger miles. But it is the stocks which convey economic possibilities. And the reason the underlying analysis, which asks you to look at stocks in national accounts rather than flows, is based on a theorem that my friend and colleague, Karl-Johan Mailer, and I proved 25 years ago, I guess 2000 is when we published our paper, which we showed that instead of income, we ought to be measuring wealth. And when I say wealth, I mean not only stocks of manufactured capital and human capital, but natural capital as well. So the social worth of all the assets that a community has. And that's the thing that needs to be measured, because that tells us whether the future is promising or it isn't. It's a tight theorem, by the way. It says that if wealth increases, then human well-being increases, and vice versa. The two are two sides of the same coin. And when I say human well-being, I mean welfare across the generations. Okay. So the Brundtland Commission reports recommendation that sustainable development should be development where a path of development in which each generation hands over at least as much of stock assets they had themselves inherited. That fits in very nicely with this theorem. In fact, it just says that precisely that. It says if you hand over the value of those assets, at least as much as you had inherited yourself, then you're giving them opportunities and therefore the possibilities of progress, at least as much. Now, you can't, if you can, this is wealth. So you could have increasing wealth while increasing the produced capital and human capital, but degrading natural capital. You can do that to a point, obviously. But beyond the point, then the value of that natural capital becomes so high that at the margin, it becomes costlier and costlier to substitute away from natural capital to produce capital. That's pretty straightforward, intuitively, how that happens. So what we proved was precisely what Karl-Johan Mailer and I proved was precisely that, yes, it is wealth, which is the measure of well-being, that's for sure. But that if you have eaten too much into natural capital, or if you continue doing that, then the cost becomes higher and higher and higher, and you may not be able to do it. Which is why in my more recent work, I have, at least for the global economy, I've been concentrating on the natural capital side, because that's the one which is really in danger. I now mean the oceans, I mean the atmosphere, of course. Now, the carbon problem in the atmosphere is the only part of this this complexity of issues that I'm mentioning that comes up for airing all the time. But that's only one asset, namely the atmosphere as a sink for our carbon emissions. We have the oceans, we have the ecosystems, wetlands, rangelands, mangrove forests, you name it. All these ecosystems which are under threat, they should be studied now with equal attention. Because if they're under threat, basically the productive base of the economy is declining, even as you're constructing buildings and roads and factories and so forth. So it's that complexity of things that, in some senses, has been the center of my attention for the last 20, 25 years. But that theorem is, what led to the theorem was Mailer's and my interest in seeing what is it that we should, it's all very well to say GDP is a bad idea. I mean, GDP growth is not a good measure, not a bad idea, it's not a good measure of progress. So then the right question is, what is? What is the right measure? And what we showed was that it is wealth. Wealth inclusive of natural capital.